Good morning, everyone. It's a bright sunny day in the studio today, so I'm squinty a little bit. This is probably the last video in this particular gown making session. We are going to finish the gown and decorate the ever-living tar out of it. Lots and lots of ruching. I've been getting a lot of really great comments down in the comment section below, and that's going to help me build other videos for you. Let me know what you want to see and I will see if I can build one for you. My name is Kelly Grant. I'm proprietress of Sweet Shoe Historical Clothing, and all of these videos are to help you through your gown making process. Today we're going to finish the back neck edge of the gown, add some cuffs that I've already cut, and decorate the stomacher with this roll of ruching that I've made, and decorate the front gown edge with this roll of ruching that I have made. And with all of these ruched bits, I have literally just pinked the edges. I'm not hemming them or anything. Pinking is more than stable enough, and I'll be using a running stitch, but I'll get into that a bit later once I get to that point in the gown making process. But first we're going to tackle that neck edge so that it's nice and finished. And that's really all you need to do with a gown. The decoration is just icing on the cake, or decorative icing on the cake, so to speak. There's the back neck edge that we're working on, and I've cut a strip of cloth that's 4 inches wide, maybe a little shy of 4 inches wide, and I folded it and pressed it into shape. And the next step will be to cut it to length and fold under the edges. And I want to have this on a bit of an angle to match the shoulder line of the shoulder strap. And how I'm going to do that is fold it in on itself like that and press it so that it's not quite square. To the main body of the trim. And trust me, it's a lot easier to put things in place when you've pressed them ahead of time. Let's move that out of the way. So that'll go there, and then over here, that's where I want to fold, so I'm going to trim off the excess. And give it a little press. And now I can pin it in place. And I'm going to open it up so that that center line fold is open, and I'm going to position it so that that center line fold is at the top of that cut edge. And now I'm going to start stitching, probably from this side so that I'm going in the right direction for my hands. I'll start at this point where the shoulder strap meets the neck edge. Go down that little, so I'll start here, go down to the bottom of that band, across the band, up. And then I'll fold the inside in place and pin that. And I'm just going to use a whip stitch. So I'm coming up at that center line fold of the neck binding with my knot and tucking the knot end in underneath. And then positioning where I want to make my first stitch and stitching it down. And I'm just using a little whip stitch. Sewing up to the straight pin and then pulling the straight pin up, out. My stitch length is about 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch. Now that I've gotten to that other shoulder strap and where I want that point to meet, I'm also conveniently at the end of my thread, so I'm going to finish off my thread with a couple of knots, hide my tail. Now I will fold and pin everything to the inside and start a new thread. And again, I'm going to come up in that point with my knotted thread where I want it to join the shoulder strap. And then I'm going to start whip stitching along. And at the end, making a knot. and hiding my tail in between the layers of the cloth. There, neck edge is done. Next up, hem. So I have cut off the hem evenly where I want it to sit. I'm going to polonaise this dress, so it's long, but not as long as a full-length gown is. I'm wanting something a little different, so we're going to start at the front edge. And press down that front edge. Because it's on the selvage, we aren't going to turn it under a second time. I'm just going to leave it like that. And then along the bottom edge, I'm going to fold it twice. And a second time. And I'm going to fold and press this hem edge all the way along to the other side, and then fold under the front edge on the other side, the same as what I did here. And yes, I'm doing this and pressing it so that it's easier to sew when I go to sit down to stitch. Now I'm just not going to worry about those top skirt edges. They're going to hang out back there and not be worrisome at all. What I'm going to do is at the very top of the skirt where it meets the bodice, I'm going to do a running stitch down that front edge. And that's all that you need. And I'm really close to that salvage edge. I'm going to tuck my knot inside. And my stitch length is probably about 2 millimeters long. These two front edges really have no structural integrity. They're just hems to hold that front edge back. So a running stitch is really all you need in this situation. And it doesn't need to be folded under twice because that salvage is really nice and tidy, and we're just going to follow along with it all the way down to the front edge. I'll be back in a minute. Now that I've gotten to that bottom edge, I'm going to switch from a running stitch to a hem stitch. And I'm going to creep back to the beginning by just running my needle in between the two layers of fabric so that I can pick up the beginning of that hem. And I'm going to do a little knot to start. And then I'm just going to hem stitch. So I'm going to pick up a little bit of the body of the fabric and then come up in the fold. Pick up a little bit of the body of the fabric and then come up in the fold. So I'm going to pick up the fashion layer and the fold. Fashion layer and the fold. So that's what the hem stitch looks like. Okay, gang, I have finished hemming. It's good 2.5 hours later. That's how long it takes. So I've finished hemming the gown. I added a couple of polonaise ties to the side back seams and a couple of loops to the skirt to polonaise it up. Give her a little bit more oomph. And now I'm going to start decorating. I'm going to start with the sleeves. And the sleeves have a cuff, but not one that hangs down. It's a decorative cuff that's attached to the sleeve really firmly. And that's the shape of it. Let's see. There's the shape of it. The bottom edge being the arm bottom edge, and the top edge being the top edge of the cuff. And what'll happen is that'll get gathered in and stitched and applied to the cuff. And I'll take pictures of that so you can see up close. So I have cut 2 cuff pieces for each sleeve. So one for the upper sleeve and one for the under sleeve. And I'm going to put them right sides together and sew the seams first. And I'm just going to do a running stitch so they're in 2 pieces and right sides together, using as small a seam allowance as possible. I'm going to stitch across this curved edge with a running stitch, and then that straight edge with a running stitch. And I'm going to press my seam allowances open, knot my thread both ways. But yeah, I'm only going to use like a 1/4 inch seam allowance if I can get away with it. Maybe even a tiny 1/4 inch, so less than a 1/4 inch, because I want to be able to have as much sleeve to gather, or much cuff to gather into that sleeve as I possibly can. Now you can see here that I've already pieced in a piece because I'm using scrap fabric. I want to use as much of the cabbage as I possibly can so that I'm making the most efficient use of cloth. There, my thread is ready. Put a little knot in the end. And yeah, I'm going to pin. It's just a short seam, but I want that edge to stay nice and even, and I want my starting line and my finishing line to be nice and even. And just a running stitch. This seam just needs to be held together. It's not structural. It's not supportive. It's just decoration. So like I said, I'm going to stitch that seam, and then I'm going to stitch this seam, the short seam, and do the same for the other one and press my seam allowances open. Okay, so I've gotten my 4 seams done. Now I'm going to press those seam allowances open, once again using my pressing tools. These ones are on the curve, so you want that curve to stay in there. And there's my cuff ready to be applied to the sleeve. And one for the other side. Now, what I'm going to do is run a gathering stitch and about an inch in from both the top edge and the bottom edge. And I'm going to use 4 threads. So one on this side, one on that side, then one on this side and one on that side. And I'm going to run a length of thread and leave it hanging. And I'm going to start at the 4 sleeve seam. So I'm going to start at that short seam and work my way to the back seam, and then work my way to the back seam, work my way to the back seam, and work my way to the back seam. So I'll have 4 threads hanging off at the back. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to knot it at the front and leave it hanging at the back so that I can draw in the sleeve and then use those threads to stitch it to the sleeve. I'm going to come up from the underside, hiding my knot, and then just work an even running stitch along that edge, the same distance from the cut edge all the way along. And there I am at the back seam. I'm not going to do any back stitching or anything. I'm just going to unthread my needle and start over again. I have a slub in my thread, so I've pulled off the majority of it. And now I'm re-waxing it. And giving it a press. Gonna wait for that needle to cool off a bit. No, it doesn't want to work with me, so I'm going to cut it off and rethread my needle. There we go. And coming up from the underside, hiding my knot, just running a running stitch again. And here I am at the back seam again. And I'm going to unthread my needle and start over again. Because I'm wanting to line up with that original stitching line going on the other direction. I'm coming up fairly close to it going in this direction. And we're coming back up on that back seam, and I want to line up my stitching line with that first row of gathering so that it's nice and even. Undo the thread, one more thread to go. One last time, coming up very near that first row of stitching. And again, I'm coming up on that back seam, and I want to make sure that my stitching lines meet up. And that's so I have an even frill on the top and bottom edge. Okay, there's my cuff with my 4 gathering threads. And I'm going to go do the other one. Okay, so I've gotten my 2 cuffs ready, and what I want to do is line up this back seam of the cuff with that dart, because that's the back of the elbow. And I want the ruffle to hang down a little bit. So I'm going to match up that back seam with the dart. And my ruffle is hanging down probably about 1/4 of an inch past the edge of the sleeve. And then I'm cupping the sleeve with my hand. I have one hand inside and one hand outside. And I'm going to pin that back seam in place. And now I'm going to determine where my front edge is of my sleeve, because there's no seam at the front edge. And I'm going to pin that front edge in place. I do it this way because I am right-handed. And I don't want to twist that cuff. I just want it to lay smoothly. So that front edge is in place. And now you can see all of the play that's involved here in this cuff. That needs to be gathered up. Untying my threads, gathering up so that it's nicely gathered all the way along and eased up to match the cuff edge of the sleeve. Oh, it's going to be nice and fluffy. And I'm going to spend some time easing in my gathers nicely so that I'm happy with them. And I'm going to hitch off my easing thread, not cutting it off, just hitching it to the needle so that I can move those gathers around and not have it ungather itself. going to do the same with the back thread. So there's the cuff edge done. And now I'm going to do the top edge. And I'm going to spend some time again making sure that my ruching is nicely evenly spaced and that my cuff is fully extended upwards. And I'm supporting it with my hand underneath to pull those ruching nice and tightly upwards. Now, you may be tempted to take the iron and press that down, because that's what you see in extent garments. But I want to warn against that right at the moment, because I'm not entirely sure those ruches would be pressed down. I have a feeling that a lot of those gathering bits and ruching bits have been squashed with time. Okay, so now that everything is in place, I'm going to grab my sewing needle again, and I'm going to unhitch those easing threads very carefully. There's one. So I'm going to start in this direction. Rethread my needle with that same thread. And now I'm going to very carefully backstitch that ruching in place. And I've got my finger on the underside so that I can feel if my stitching is going through. And I want to space my back stitches so that I'm catching the easing thread, but not entirely nailing down that ease line like I would if I was using a sewing machine. I want to keep that loft. And remember that this is just decoration. It's not structural. It doesn't need to hold parts of the body contained. It just needs to look pretty. And I'm adjusting my easing as I go. So I'm going to do this exact same method with all 4 of those threads. And then I'll do the exact same thing to the other sleeve. So this is what the finished sleeve cuff looks like, all gathered and stitched into place, and it sits right on the end of the sleeve. So the cuff encases the elbow of the sleeve. Good morning, folks. I am getting ready to add ruching to the gown, because why not add more ruching? I have 2 pieces that I have pinned together that are shaped. It gets fat down here at the end and skinny up here at the top. And I'm going to piece those together with just a running stitch, press my seams open, and then get to plotting it out on the gown. Alrighty then, my ruching strips have all been stitched together. They are in graduating widths as we go down the front of the gown. And I've located my center back point, which is where that bone is on the back of your spine. And that's where I'm going to start laying out where I want the ruching to go. I'm going to put a pin there so that I can hold it in place. And then I'm going to work along one front edge at a time. I'm going to make sure there's no twists in the fabric. And that I have one ruching strip and not both of them. And I'm going to put the bottom of that ruching strip at the hem. And I'm going to pin that in place. My ruching strips are the same as the cuffs in that they were just pinked with no other seam allowance treatment, and I want it that way so that they get a little fluffy on the edges and look a little bit worn. I'm going to run 2 rows of gathering stitch, probably about an inch in from either edge, starting from the center back and working my way to the hem. And then I'm going to gather it up and ease it into the length of the front of the gown, starting at the center back, working over the shoulder and down the front edge. So I'll do that, run those 2 gathering stitches and ease it up and show you what it looks like when I've gotten to that point. So through the magic of editing, Pierre can make it look like I haven't been riding the struggle bus all morning, pretty much all day. It's not that difficult to sew ruching. It's sewing strips together, but I have managed to sew right side to wrong side. I sewed the hem together at one point instead of the back neck edge. Yeah, it's been a day of sewing, but it's gathered, it's ruched, and it's on the garment now, and my next step will be to tack all of these gathers down, and I'm going to use a running back stitch like I did with the cuff and get that all stitched on. That's what the cuff looks like. And I'll take pictures so that you can see up close and personal the ruching on both the cuff and the front edge, but I'm really happy with how it's turning out. It's such a simple little thing, but it makes such a difference to the look of the gown. It's going to look finished because I have decorated it. And it's a type of decoration that suits the client that is going to be wearing it. She is very feminine. She loves trim, and the pattern is going to stand out, but then all of the extra layers that we put on it is going to take it over the top and make her look gorgeous. So my next step now is to wax up some more thread and keep hand sewing. And you guys don't need to be watching hours and hours of YouTube hand sewing. This is not Norwegian TV or Swedish TV, where we watch me doing mind-numbingly boring things for the rest of the day. But I'm going to sew the ruching on the front, stitch the other stuff for the other side and do that, and then the last thing will come back and I will show you what I'm going to be doing with the stomacher, which is going to be more ruching but in a different style, and I'll take you through that thought process as well. Okay, I'm back to sewing again. Well guys, it is dark and it is bedtime, and I have run out of time in the day to sew today, but the trim is now on the gown on both sides. and stitched on. And I have begun trimming out the stomacher. And I think what I'm going to do is run a center line out and then a nice V shape around the outside edge, but not going all the way out to this outside edge. I want Jenny to have enough room to pin and the stomacher floof to be seen. So I'm going to bring that floof in probably about there along the edge so that she'll have all this space to pin her gown to on either side. And it'll also make her look thinner because that V will be nice and long and thin. But that's for tomorrow morning. Hopefully before she arrives to get dressed so that I can take photographs and finish things up for the dissertation, which is being sent out on Friday. And you can see out the window how dark it is out there. Yeah, pretty dark. It's acting like a mirror. So yeah, I'm committing sins against one of my cardinal rules of sewing after dark. I have pushed myself as far as I can today. I started sewing at about 10 o'clock this morning once everybody was fed breakfast and the barn was opened, and I applied for a job and all those good things that you do first thing in the morning. Oh, coffee. Coffee was a long time ago. But now I'm finding that I'm having a hard time holding on to my sewing needle and having a hard time seeing, even with my glasses on. So before I make a mistake, I'm going to call it quits for the evening and let Pierre upload all of this video content that I made today. And I will be back at it bright and early tomorrow morning in the daylight. Jenny's coming early afternoon, and we are going to take photographs tomorrow. And Pierre will start editing the final video for the YouTube channel before submission, and we will get stuff done. So yeah. Everybody, have a great night. I'm going to bed. I'm tired. I'll see you in the morning. Well, there we have it. The last little bit of sewing to do for Jenny's Dutch lady impression is her stomacher, and it's all finished and all stitched down. And I have brought it back away from the edge so that there's room to pin the gown to the stomacher and still have the stomacher decoration appear first and foremost. And the way that I've decorated it too, it's going to make her look even taller than she is already and more thin because of the linear lines that we have established with the decoration. This is more decoration I have done on an 18th century dress in a very long time, but I am really happy with the results. So there we go. One Dutch lady. Dry run this afternoon for photographs. Talk to you later. So we did a dry run and took some photographs for the dissertation. Here's Jenny and JR in their new clothes, based on the original image that's coming up next. And I did a couple of alterations to Jenny's gown and JR's breeches, and now they are happy with their final clothing. You can see that the gown is polonaise nicely in the back, showing off all of Jenny's curves and stature beautifully. She's very happy.